Hey guys, welcome back to the studio for another lesson. This week, I'm going to take you through some methods that I use to practice incorporating chromaticism into my lines. To keep things simple and digestible, we're going to do all of this over a 2-5-1 in B-flat major. First, we'll go through a typical approach to playing a scale outline over these changes, and then we'll expand our thinking a little bit by making use of the Barry Harris chromatic scale concept in a couple of different ways. Once you understand how that works, I'll show you an exercise that incorporates both the chromatic scale concept and chromatic enclosure cells that we've covered in the past. Finally, we'll look at how we can incorporate these sounds into more fully realized lines over our 2-5-1 that make use of as much chromaticism as possible, while still sounding cogent and inside the changes. You guys ready? Let's get started. One of the things I find my students grappling with the most when they're really starting to work on improvising and improving their bebop language is the application of chromaticism to their lines. There's a lot of different systems for doing this, and we've covered a handful of those ideas here at the studio in previous videos. Today, I want to expand on two chromatic concepts that I've taught you about before. Specifically, we'll be looking at Barry Harris's chromatic scale concept and using chromatic enclosures. Since we're going to do all this work over the humble 2-5-1, we should first do a quick outline of the more typical scales we'd use to approach this harmony. Here's what that would sound like. If you've been hanging around here at the studio, you're undoubtedly familiar with this approach by now. Over C minor and F7, we went up and down the F7 scale so that all the notes of the chord land on the beat. Then over B-flat major, we did the same thing with our B-flat major scale. Since both of these options share the same exact notes, we can get away with playing the F7 chromatic scale over the entire thing. Over the 2-5, we're going to go up the scale, and then over the 1 chord, we'll come back down. Now, take a listen to what that sounds like, and then we'll break things down together. Now, this is more chromaticism than I would typically use in an improvised line, but it's important to know that we have all of these options and that we can pop out of a run like this at any point and play other elements of bebop language. Now, just so we're all on the same page, though, let's break down how this approach to playing a chromatic scale like this functions according to Dr. Barry Harris. The basic idea is that we want to put a half step between every note of the scale so that all of the actual scale notes land on the beat. Most of the time, we'll be able to do this with actual chromatic half steps, but occasionally there's no half step possible, so we just need to add a sort of rhythmic placeholder that still functions like a half step. If we start at the root of F7, we can go perfectly chromatic up to the 3rd. Now keep this in mind as it'll be important later. Once we get to the 3rd, though, we'll sidestep the 4th using this note, the 5th, as a rhythmic placeholder. Then we'll come back down and continue our chromatic run all the way up to the 6th. Between 6 and flat 7, there's no half step possible, so we'll do the same thing we did last time and sidestep this time to the root, using it as a rhythmic placeholder, then dropping back down to flat 7 on the beat. And from there, we can just run up the scale to the root. On the way down, we'll need similar strategies in the same spots. Starting on the root, we can run down to flat 7, and then we need to put a rhythmic placeholder here, so we'll sidestep back up to the root and then drop down to 6. From the 6th, we can run chromatic all the way to the 4th. And then from 4 to 3, we'll again need a rhythmic placeholder, so I'll sidestep back up to 5 and then drop down to the 3rd so that it lands on the beat. And finally, we can run chromatically from 3 back down to the root to finish things up. This is a super powerful concept, and it can really get you out of a jam and help you to kickstart lines with a chromatic run, either up or down. We don't have to use it over just the dominant scale when applying it to our 2-5. In this next outline, we'll use the F7 chromatic scale going up over both the 2 and the 5 chords. Then over the 1 chord, we'll use the B-flat major chromatic and run that up for 2 measures as well. Here's how that sounds. Up next, I'll show you guys an exercise that I cooked up to practice playing with different portions of the ascending chromatic run while incorporating enclosures around chord tones of either the 2 or the 5 chord. In the last section, I told you to hang on to an idea from the breakdown of the F7 chromatic scale since it'd be important later on. That important bit of information was running chromatic from the root to the third. If we turn this idea into a melodic cell and then create a line around it that targets chord tones of our 5 chord using chromatic enclosures, we can then turn that line into an exercise to play through the entire scale and make it do some serious heavy lifting for us. Take a listen to the initial line first, and then I'll show you how to run it through the entire scale. On its own, this is a pretty slick line that not only functions over static F7, but also a long 2-5 in B flat. Now, the main thing we're trying to get out of it, though, is the shape and structure so that we can run that through the entire scale. When we do that, we're going to end up playing around notes of the 2 chord in this key when we start on a non-chord tone, and when we start on a chord tone, we'll be playing around notes of the 5 chord. Here's the whole exercise for you to take a listen to now. This one's pretty meaty and it sounds really slick when you work it up to a bebop tempo. Up next, I'm going to show you some phrases that I wrote out for you guys that incorporate all of this chromaticism in a few different ways so you get an idea of how I like to practice improvising lines that sound like this. Before we get to that though, I need to give a quick shout out to TrueFire.com for supporting the channel. TrueFire is an online lesson library that's host to literally thousands of courses on a wide range of musical topics from some really amazing artists and educators, including yours truly. If you're interested in improving your comping, make sure to check out my course, Exploring Melodic Jazz Comping, available on TrueFire now. In this course, I'll demonstrate and break down 17 essential comping approaches using TrueFire's interactive learning tools. We'll work on crafting more sophisticated comping parts using drop-2 voicing, chord substitutions, approach chords, diminished concepts, and voice leading. We'll also dive into triadic approaches, partial chords, using scales as chords, and the art of borrowing notes and dominants. You'll learn how these melodic comping approaches can be artistically applied using backing tracks based on the changes to popular jazz standards like Autumn Leaves, There'll Never Be Another You, and All the Things You Are. The link to the course is in the description of this video. Now let's get back to the lesson and check out some ways we can incorporate all this chromaticism into lines that function really well over a 2-5 in B flat. When I'm spending time working on chromaticism in my lines, I'll typically focus on a specific idea and try to improvise lines that make use of that concept. In this case, I've written out a bunch of different lines for you guys to practice, incorporating some of the things that I've shown you today. The first phrase is going to make use of that root going chromatically to the third cell we went over in the last section. Here's that phrase for you to take a listen to now. There's lots of other places you could go once you get to the third of the F7, but I wanted to use as much chromaticism as possible while still sounding inside the changes. Here's another example of a phrase I might play using the same chromatic cell as a jumping off point. Instead of going straight up the chord from the third of F, I opted for a pivot arpeggio that time, and it completely changed the way that I went about finishing up the line. I also opted to use some of the half-step rules for the major scale and a Barry Harris stock phrase to wrap things up in a cogent sounding way. I also like to practice running up the F7 chromatic scale for a longer run and seeing how I can complete a line in as many ways as possible from that point. In these next two examples, we'll run up the scale from root to fifth, and then play a line incorporating as many bits of bebop language as we can. Here's the first one for you to check out now. When I'm working on this kind of language, I always try my best to make sure that the voice leading is coherent and that I'm sticking as close to the changes as possible. When you're using so much chromaticism, it's really easy for the line to get away from the chords, so don't worry about playing outside too much, or things can just end up sounding chaotic. Here's another example phrase using our same F7 chromatic starting cell. In the PDF for today's lesson, you'll find a total of 50 phrases that use different F7 chromatic scale starting points. All these different ideas work beautifully over a 2/5 in B-flat major, and I'm sure with some creativity and a little bit of harmonic analysis, you can find other applications for them as well. And before we wrap up, I want to show you guys another way that I like to play with chromaticism that subverts our typical go up a chord, come down a scale strategy. Lately, I've spent a lot of time working out lines when coming down chords, starting on non-chord tones, and then pivoting back up, before making use of my typical bebop language. If you listen to bebop masters like Sonny Stitt, Dexter Gordon, or Sonny Rollins, you'll hear this kind of approach all the time, and it's really pretty. So as a bonus to today's material, I've also cooked up a bunch of phrases for you using that structure, and then incorporating the chromatic dominant scale ideas. Here's one of the phrases for you to take a listen to now. This has become one of my favorite sounds to work with, and there's something about that leap up of a sixth after coming down the chord that always sounds so dramatic to me. Here's one more example for you guys to check out. Thanks so much for sticking around all the way to the end of the video. There's absolutely a lot more you can do with this approach to practicing chromaticism in your lines, so make sure to let me know in the comments if you guys have any questions about this stuff, or if you just want to see more on this topic. As always, if you found today's lesson helpful, make sure you give the video a like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and hit that bell for notifications too. If you want to access the PDF for today's lesson, you can grab that along with the whole back catalog for all the videos on the channel for as little as $10 a month over at my Patreon page, or by just hitting the join button right here on YouTube. A special thanks goes out to Ron Maestas, Alf Collins, Juan Doming, Ruthenio Fiuza, and Carlos Fernandez for being studio fans. I really appreciate the support. An extra special thanks is due to these studio members for their support as well. Christoph Schmid, Chinedu Ogbodo, Patrick Caron, Darren Lund, Johnny Stocks, Bertrand Chesnay, Paul Marin, Andy, James O'Connor, S. Bruce 1234, Thomas Clenchafore, Martin Vigers, Mark Eslick, Carol, Robert Allaire, Daniel Alvarenga, Robert Cody, Al Moraney, Lambert, Gregory Chu, Vaughn Davis, Nick Hess, Louis Maiden, Brendan Kelly, T. Colston, Andrew McBride, Aldo Fonseca, Jason Paul Dubois, Ron Askew, Raymond DeGloro, James Seabury, Bruce Wood, Bill Benfield, Sean Lepore, Stephen White, Salkai Zoltan, Albalos Gelivert, Justin Fisher, Milan de Kaiser, David Wertman, Zay Soares, Artie Sanchez, Louis Rosen, Stephen Prager, Skemster, Everton Armstrong, Stephen Schwartz, Max Irwin, David Zuckerbraun, and PH. An extra special shout out to Jazz Luminaire patron Bill Jacob. Thank you guys all so much for your continued support. I'm David Shore, and thanks again for hanging with me at the studio today. I'll see you guys next time.